Hi there. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out AppIgnition. This video will be the first of many to detail the several features AppIgnition provides to enhance your development experience. A big inspiration for this project was to make the process of starting a new and reliable Laravel application much easier, which comes with the added benefit of allowing you to onboard new team members for an existing project much easier as well. In this video, I'll walk through the standard scenario of installing a new application from start to finish. So with that, let's get started. The first thing you'll be asked after installing AppIgnition is where you want your default workspace to be located on your machine. This is where all of your applications and the repository of containers to run them will be located. By default, it will be located in your personal folder under the AppIgnition directory. Next, you'll be asked how you'd like to get started. AppIgnition has the ability to import existing workspaces for applications that have been installed on a different machine. This is ideal for when you're onboarding new team members to an existing project, but I'll be reviewing that process in a future video. For now, we'll start from scratch. AppIgnition has two different items you need to configure before installing your first application. First, we need to create an application. We can either choose to clone an existing repository or create a new Laravel application that will pull the version of our choosing. Let's go with that approach. We'll need to first give the application a name, and then we can choose what version of Laravel we'd like to use. By default, it will install the latest version. For this application, I'm just going to call it blog. After creating the application, you'll have several more features available to you. Starting at the top, you can choose what type of continuous integration configuration you'd like to install. By default, a configuration file for GitHub Actions will be created that will run your tests, formatting, and static analysis checks for all pull requests against the configured branch. You can leave the default main branch as an option, but also add additional branches as well, such as a future branch. You can then choose to run your test with code coverage and specify a minimum percentage of code coverage. Next, you'll be able to choose from a wide variety of Laravel packages that can either improve your development experience or accomplish a piece of functionality that you're looking for. Each package has links for learning more about them and my own personal opinion on when they're helpful. When you're satisfied with your selections, you can simply hit Save. Now, with our application configured, we then need to configure the containers we want on our local machine that can run it. You can either manually choose from a list of pre-built containers by clicking the second option, but my personal recommendation is to follow the wizard. Through each step of the wizard, it will present you with the different types of containers you might need to run your application, at which point you only need to select the one that you're most comfortable with. So, using our blog application as an example, I would like to run the Nginx web server. I am most comfortable with a MySQL database. I want to use phpMyAdmin to connect to the database. I'll use Redis for caching, the PHP worker for handling any background jobs, Mailhog for testing my possible emails, and then Selenium for running my acceptance tests. Now that all of my containers have been added to my environment, I want to quickly talk about the workspace container. The workspace container won't be needed in production, but it will contain all of the software you'll need to develop your application. The intention of the workspace container is for you to code directly inside of it, thus preventing you from having to install any of your needed software on your local machine. On this page, you can select the PHP version you'd like to use, the Node version for front-end assets, and additional PHP extensions that your application might need. It's also worth noting that every other container you've added can be configured the same way. Going through our checklist, we've added our first application and all of the containers we'll need to run it. That means we're finally ready to start the installation. However, for any new application being installed on your machine, we'll need to configure a host record so that not only we can access it, but your containers can access it as well. You can either choose to add this yourself by copying the record and adding it to the specified host file, or we can let AppIgnition do this on your behalf. What we're seeing now is the extension building the Docker images for the containers I configured earlier. Once finished, the containers will start, and then my application will be installed inside the workspace container. It will automatically install all of the Composer dependencies, any of the plugins I selected when creating my application, and then configure my application's environment to automatically connect to my container services. This could take several minutes, but once finished, the URL of your application will be opened in your default browser. I'm going to let this run, and we'll continue when it's finished. Perfect. Our installation just finished. Immediately, our application, our blog, has loaded up. If we navigate back to AppIgnition, and then the dashboard, we'll have several new features available to us. First, you'll notice our containers that have web interfaces have a link to open them on your local machine. For instance, MailHog will have a link to open its web client where we can see any emails sent by our application. Our application will have a link to it to open it up in a browser, much like we saw when the installation finished. The menu for the application will have an option to open it inside of the workspace container through a terminal. This is where you can create or run migrations, run artisan commands, or install other Composer dependencies. Lastly, if configured correctly, there will be an option to open your project immediately in a VS Code dev container. This feature requires a small amount of configuration, which I will cover in a future video. For now, we'll look at some of the files that have been added. First off, the environment has been configured automatically to connect to all of your configured containers. An environment has been made for your tests, and Dusk if you choose to use it later on. If we navigate to the GitHub directory, you'll notice a configuration file for running a GitHub action. The steps it will perform will be dependent on the settings configured for your application and containers before the installation took place. Next, taking a look at the Vite configuration file, it is automatically be configured to run hot module replacement from inside the workspace container. And finally, the AppIgnition folder holds two important files. The environment file is used to configure your containers for running your continuous integration, and the JSON file stores your workspace's configuration. This will be extremely helpful for onboarding new team members, and I'll show you why in a future video. And with that, congratulations! We installed our first application and are ready to get started developing. You're free to come back here and reconfigure your environment at any time. Thank you so much for your interest, and best of luck.